You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Welcome to The Open Door, a show based on the words in Revelation, "I have left an open door before you, which no one can close." This is WCAT Radio's longest-running show, which opened the door to the radio station in October 2016. It's currently offered by Jim Hanink, Mario Ramos Reyes and friends, and remains open to the love of God in its call to build a culture of life and a just social order through the panel's discussion of the Catholic social teaching principles of solidarity, subsidiarity, and economic democracy. The Open Door also explores nonviolence, distributism, and communitarianism. So join us at the Open Door, where you too can be part of the conversation.
Welcome to the Open Door. Jim Hanink here, and I'll introduce you shortly to our guest, Frank Calneggia. And you might be wondering, you faithful members of our audience, where's Mario? And where's Christopher? Well, I have a hypothesis for each. Mario might be involved in the launch of his most recent book, Filosofía para Tiempos Misteriosos, Philosophy for Mysterious Times. And I think he's chosen a worthy title, and so we can give him a pass. Now, what about Christopher Zender? You know, the guy with the beard that just keeps going and flowing? Well, it's his birthday today, and he warned us that he might not be able to make it. And so you're probably asking yourselves, just how old is he? None of us really know. But we remember that for a good many years he was 39, and then suddenly he's advanced forward chronologically. At any rate, they won't be here, but we'll be able to make a couple comments about their absence when it seems like the appropriate moment. Now, we have something really special tonight. We're heading to, and virtually we're already there, Perth, the capital of West Australia. We'll be discussing theology and philosophy in the context of Catholic life in Australia. Our welcome guest, as I say, is Frank Calneggia. He's the author of Assertion and Refutation, and that's just been published by En route Books and Media. In it, he challenges another Australian thinker, the theologian Tracey Rowland. On what grounds? On what grounds? Not because she's from Australia. He doesn't mind that at all. So why is he challenging her? He's challenging her on the basis of her recasting, revising. Well, we'll see. On the basis of her understanding of natural law. And that, you know, is a subject dear to our Thomist hearts. Now, as always, let's begin in prayer. Come, O Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful and enkindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created, and you shall renew the face of the earth. O God, who has taught the hearts of the faithful by the light of the Holy Spirit, granted by the gift of the same Spirit, we may be always truly wise and ever rejoice in his consolation. Through Christ our Lord. Amen. Frank, if we may, could you first just tell us a bit about yourself?
Certainly, Jim. First of all, thank you for the warm welcome. As you said, indeed, I live in Perth, Western Australia. You can see I'm quite rugged up at the moment. We're in the middle of winter. Temperature last night got down to about 5 degrees C, which is about 41 degrees Fahrenheit on the old scale, and rather clear skies this morning, but for the last 2 weeks it's been very wet and cold, so it's nice to have a bit of sunshine. So hopefully a bit of sunshine will throw some light on our discussions this morning.
That means no fires?
No fires, no.
Good.
No. Okay, about myself, well, I'm a cradle Catholic, and I was educated at Catholic schools from my first year of primary school up until my final year of primary school. During that time, this was started before the Second Vatican Council and concluded after the Second Vatican Council. So the Second Vatican Council was sort of in almost the middle part of my school education. My religious education up to about the time of the Vatican Council, maybe a bit after, was what you would call normal orthodox from a catechism. After that, I sort of had the expectation, my appetite had been whetted, if you'd like to call it that, of, continuing in that sort of vein, but it sort of petered out and we got all sorts of strange things being taught to us. I didn't understand it at the time, but evolution was certainly presented to us in that period of time. Anyway, I finished school and studied at a technical university for 4 years doing a Bachelor of Electrical Engineering, and I worked thereafter for most of my life in the area of power generation, which is quite a technical specialist area of work, but I've also worked in most areas of electrical production and so forth. But anyway, as I reached sort of towards my late 20s, I came across some booklets, written Ronioed sheets, articles written by an Australian author who was actually an immigrant to this country from Holland. And he was writing about the errors found in the philosophy and theology of Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. Well, when I started reading this, I started to realise that this sounded very much like what was going on in my later years of high school, why it was different than it had been up until confirmation and thereafter. Anyway, so I started to communicate with this man, and by letter, I started to read more of his works. And in those works, that was really, from reading his works, that was really where I started to get a bit of knowledge about the philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas, because he was a Thomist, and he made reference quite substantially in what he had written to the works of St. Thomas. So that prompted me to go and look up these works, which are papal encyclicals, and I started to read papal encyclicals, and really that's where my interest and first instruction in the philosophy of St. Thomas came from. And thereafter, you might say I've simply continued by reading good Thomas. I've had a couple of very good friends, like that man, for instance, and another one who I subsequently met, who was a very good Thomist. And through discussions, reading material, good books. One good book is worth 1,000 useless ones. So if you read books by good authors, then you can really learn a lot. And this is necessary in this particular time, even back then, because you really couldn't study the philosophy of St. Thomas at a university, even a Catholic one if you had one around, because it just wasn't given. So anyway, that was the background of my education. Now I'm retired, and I'm still very much interested in the philosophy of St. Thomas. And also, just over the past couple of years, I've decided to learn the language of my father's forefathers. My father was an Italian immigrant, and about 2 years ago I decided I was going to learn Italian. So now I'm in the process of learning the beautiful language, as they call it. I understand a lot of what I hear and read, but I need speaking practice. So if I can find some good speaking dialogue partners, then that would be great. But anyway, that's sort of the rough background. I'm now retired, as I said, and I enjoy other things like fishing and playing a bit of golf occasionally, and so forth. So that's effectively.
Frank, I gotta just say one thing. On this show, we never say retired. We say redirected.
Redirected.
Redirected. Right. We don't allow that. We don't allow the R word on this show.
Well, that's true. Now I have much more time available to do the things that I like, and learning Italian is one of them. Studying philosophy is another, and so forth. So certainly, I find now that I am redirected. Oh, that even starts with an R. I find now that I have a new direction.
I'll tell you, Frank, when I went to the Human Resources Department at my old employers, Human Resources, the very name of the place sounds vaguely cannibalistic. But when I went to Human Resources and they said, so you're a retiree, I said, no, that rhymes with deportee. I'm not a retiree. I'm redirected. And in their usual wisdom, they said, whatever. Whatever. Well, redirected as you are, and with the interests you have, maybe you could give us a sense of your impressions, at any rate, of how the church in Australia is faring. Now, I happen to do a little digging on Perth, and there are more Catholics in Perth than members of any other Christian church or members of any other, well, to use an expression, faith tradition. So there's got to be some Catholic life. And how fares it in Perth and elsewhere in Australia?
Certainly, but like America, like so many other countries in the formerly Christian West, mass attendances are dwindling. Even over the past 2 years, with all these COVID lockdowns, for example, at the beginning of all these lockdowns, the bishops relaxed the Sunday Mass obligation. And I've noticed even since then, the numbers have dwindled and people have gone away and not returned. And that's a big problem. Catholic education here is probably been in the doldrums for many years. Catholic, a lot of people might identify as Catholics, and you'll find that these days, the more fervent ones, and if you go to any of the big churches in the archdiocese, like for masses or devotional practices like novenas and things like that, you'll find that most of those now in the church are either Filipinos, Indian, Vietnamese, and these are all immigrants who've come here subsequent to 1980, even 1990, the more recent immigrants. The earlier immigrants to this country, for example, after Second World War, I'm talking about Perth particularly, were a lot of Italians from the south of Italy, Polish, Yugoslavs, mostly Croatians, some Serbians. And in those days, a lot of the practicing Catholics were from those backgrounds, but they seem, some of them obviously do practice. You can't make a specific statement, but as I say, there's a general falling off of Catholic life in mass attendance, for example. There's been, much like in your country, there's been problems with sexual abuse of minors by clergy and things like that. So we have all the evils here that you do in your country as well, even though you have a much larger population than what we do. Proportionately, we probably have a similar type of problem, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Now, I've had an occasion to read from time to time things written by Archbishop Anthony Fisher.
Certainly.
And I understand he's the successor of Cardinal Pell.
That's correct.
What kind of leadership have you seen from Archbishop Fisher?
I'm very impressed with Archbishop Fisher. Faith-wise, he's very, very orthodox. He's not frightened to put proper moral principles in the public square. For example, in Australia, abortion laws are under state government control. Now, in the state of Western Australia, abortion was decriminalised in 1998. Now, in New South Wales, which is more populous than Western Australia, even though it's a smaller mass area, it was decriminalised in 2019. And Archbishop Fisher was very much to the fore in opposing this publicly. Just this year, earlier this year, the New South Wales State Legislature passed the assisted dying legislation, which is effectively euthanasia. And once again, Archbishop Fisher was very much in the public forum opposing this and encouraging people to do what is right. As I say, I'm very impressed with him. And I was speaking to a friend by phone who lives in the eastern states just last Sunday, and he was saying that the attacks that are now being made in the public media on Archbishop Fisher for his forthright stances against the evil are truly diabolical. He said he's been savagely attacked in the media, so he certainly has a lot of moral courage and a lot of faith. So he's a very impressive man.
That's good to know.
It's very good to know. I think he's the shining light. I mean, I'm not judging between individuals, but I think as far as the hierarchy goes in this country, he is the shining light, certainly publicly. And yeah, I'm very impressed with him. I have a lot of time for him.
It seems that he has a lot in common with our Archbishop, Archbishop Jose Gomez, who's been very strong on respect for life issues, has written a book on euthanasia, and in California, assisted suicide is not only here, but it's expanding.
Oh, yeah.
Currently, you don't need to have a second opinion, and there's only a 48-hour waiting period, and the death certificate doesn't say assisted suicide. It's not there, so it's not a matter of record. They pretend as if it didn't even happen. And Archbishop too, himself originally from Mexico, has been very good on immigration, very good on promoting a spirit of not open borders, but real generosity towards people who are coming here. Well, all right. Now let's get philosophical. First off, how fares philosophy in Catholic institutions in Australia?
Well, the remarks I would make, I would preface first of all by saying that since the time of Pope Leo XIII in particular, there's been a very emphatic and frequent insistence from the popes on the necessity of studying the philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas in higher institutions of education, seminaries, universities, and so forth. What one notices when one looks, and I've only looked broadly at curricula, for example, of the University of Notre Dame, which has a number of campuses in Australia, one being in Perth, another one being in Sydney. Just having a cursory look at the philosophy courses there, there seems to be St. Thomas's named there, but one gets the impression that one looks at him like one would walk through a museum looking at exhibits of different paintings and sculptings and stuff like that. As one passes through, one sees him there, then one sees another artist there, and you progress through the museum. So I don't know that there's any particular emphasis given to him. Generally, I would say that the style of education presented is rather eclectic. Students are taught to pick up a bit from here, a bit there, all under the principle of becoming more critically thinking yourself. But if you don't have a yardstick by which to measure aberrant, erroneous philosophies, which generally are true in what they deny, not so much in what they affirm, then you don't really have a sound basis for making correct judgments about reality and about the way other philosophies are related to reality, because philosophy effectively is just simply a study of every aspect of reality, the world that we find ourselves in. So if there's errors, for example, in the doctrine of the nature of knowledge, or what knowledge is, whether it's just sense knowledge or whether it's just intellective knowledge, or whether it's a union of both. What are the principles of correct thinking, logic, for example, which type of logic is applied? Then the student's left in the middle of a sea of conflicting opinions, and he or she doesn't know really where to go. So, especially at the start of one's philosophical education, one needs to be guided by wise masters, and these are the great St. Thomas himself and the great Thomists who've been faithful to him, for example. Now, I suspect that sort of depth of study of St. Thomas is absent. I would say, for example, that there's very little importance placed on the papal encyclicals that have recommended St. Thomas. So, and really, if one's going to study philosophy in a high school or university, one should become familiar with those encyclicals right from the word go, So,
in his encyclical Fides et Ratio, Faith and Reason, St. John Paul II called attention to the importance of the sapiential tradition within philosophy and within, of course, Thomistic philosophy. The whole idea that philosophy brings with it a sense of wisdom and a respect for wisdom. Any awareness of that?
That's a very good question. There probably is in various teachers, but as a course overall, I think from courses overall, they seem to me to be rather eclectic. In other words, students without any real specific guidance, they're left to pick up opinions from here and there, what might appeal to their senses or to their imagination, rather than what is intellectually true or morally good. One never really can judge this particularly. You have to, as I say, you need to have this, love of truth, as St. Paul called it, love of wisdom, as St. John Paul II called it. And it's interesting to read his encyclical Fides et Ratio. It seems to be written in a different style than one might read a book written by, say, for example, one of his teachers, Father Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange, who supervised John Paul's doctoral thesis on faith in the mysticism of St. John of the Cross, for example, back in 1946-47, when John Paul was a newly ordained Father Karol Wojtyla. You read works by the both, and you see they're written in a different style, but when you read John Paul II's encyclical, you can see it's very much influenced by the same principles that, for example, Garrigou-Lagrange exposes in his own books and works. So really it is a very Thomistic encyclical, even though it's written in a different style. So, but yeah. So as far as the situation, educational-wise, certainly in secular universities, it's very atheistic, relativistic in morals, and one suspects there's this sort of influence, well, in Catholic institutions as well, you know. So I do not see a particular love or emphasis of the work of St. Thomas in these places, and that really is a worry.
Just as a sidebar, there's a very promising young Thomist in the United States, Matthew Minard, who has just translated, first time in English, 2 or 3 central texts written by Father Garrigou-Lagrange.
Oh, what's his name?
Matthew Minard. Matthew Minard.
Okay.
And it gets more interesting because he teaches at a Ruthenian seminary.
Oh, interesting.
Catholic, but the liturgy is the liturgy of the East.
Sure.
And historically, there's been a kind of edginess in Orthodox traditions about the role of Thomas and Thomism, but Matthew Minard is doing some incredible work in bridging that gap.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But now let me go ahead to 2 names that I think a fair number of people in this country have heard of. First of all, Peter Singer, and another sidebar, once upon a time I wrote a dissertation in philosophy at Michigan State University, and I was prompted in part to do so by a special spread on Peter Singer in the New York Times, and the title was "Philosophers Are Back on the Job Again." And what they meant by that really is a whole lot of philosophy has been meta-philosophy, and a whole lot of ethics has been meta-ethics, but now here's Singer dealing with hot-button issues in normative ethics. So that emboldened me to write a dissertation with the title "Persons' Rights and the Problem of Abortion." And this is going to go on as a sidebar, pardon me. But in the Supreme Court decision overturning Roe versus Wade, 2 of the philosophers cited as having muddled views about abortion were 2 philosophers that I wrote about back in, well, 1973, 1974. And then another philosopher, of course, is a philosopher who I often had recourse to when I need to have my spirits bolstered, and that's John Finnis. John Finnis. Mm-hmm. Now, Peter Singer did his dissertation under R.M. Hare, who was a kind of positivist in ethics, and John Finnis wrote his dissertation under a philosopher in England whose name momentarily escapes me. You know how those momentary escapes go.
Yes, I know who you're talking about, but once again, I can't think of his name either.
Yeah, well, we'll think of him. But a major figure.
That was at Oxford, yes?
It was... Oh, well, I can't summon it up from the depths right now. Now, so when I think of philosophy, Australia, the first 2 names that actually, HLA Hart, yes, Hart. At any rate, the first 2 names that come to mind are Peter Singer and John Finnis. And I even had an occasion to meet John Finnis once. Mm-hmm. He was on our campus. After listening to me blather on for a little bit, he said he'd like to go to the bookstore. I said, well, you won't find any books there. was so desperate he went anyway. Now, any sense, any special Australian spin, as they say, on Singer and on Finnis?
Well, the best analysis of their work that I have read was a book published by En route Books and Media at the same time that my book on Tracey Rowland was published, and that is a book by my confrere and friend, Dr. Donald Bolden. That book is called...
You mentioned him.
That book is called Natural Law, Australian Style. Now, in that book, he particularly, he treats of three ethicists, Tracey Rowland, Peter Singer, and John Finnis, with a special emphasis on the work of John Finnis. Now, I don't want to steal Don's thunder, as we say in this country, and my recommendation would be actually to study and read that book because it is really very, very good. I will say that Don finds fault with Finnis, identifies, I think, his philosophy as being more rationalist than metaphysical Aristotelian thinking, and he also points up a particular error in Finnis with regard to positive law. He said, while Finnis would, for example, be abhorred at bad laws, immoral laws, he still thinks a bad positive law can be actually called a law, whereas St. Thomas calls it a species of violence and shouldn't be a law at all. Okay, that's one thing. That's just to whet your appetite for when you read the book, and for when hopefully our viewers this evening also read the book, because it is really a very, very good book. So, and you'll get
Thanks for the tip. Thanks for the tip.
You'll get an excellent background on the actual philosophy of, philosophical thinking of both Finnis and Singer, and also Tracey Rowland. But I would point out, with regard to Tracey Rowland, Don did include a little bit of my analysis of her work, rather than him having to go through in detail and do certain things. He's made his own specific comments and analysis of her work, but he's also utilised part of my book, which is the one you mentioned at the top of the show tonight. So.
Aha. All right. Got an anecdote about Peter Singer. You'll have to put up with these anecdotes.
That's fine.
You can call me a color commentator. Peter Singer, on utilitarian grounds, argues that we have any money left over, we really ought to give it to people who are starving. And there's a merit in that position, but it was discovered that at the time he wrote one of his well-known articles, he actually was on the Riviera. A lot of people ask him about that, and his answer...
He won't have much money left over if he keeps doing that, so anyway.
He said, my answer is that right now where I live on the Riviera, it's cheaper than it would be to live in Oxford. So he had a comeback. And the last thing I'll say about Finnis, and then I'll move on. Rarely do I see a sentence in John Finnis that doesn't have 3 or 4 internal clauses in parentheses. He gives the word clotted. The word clotted. He gives a beautiful illustration. On the other hand, rarely if ever have I read through one of those sentences that I haven't learned something. Well, now...
Yeah, just one final comment on Finnis. He's associated with the new natural law theory, that's correct?
That's right.
Right. Now, my first comment when I hear terms like that, new natural law theory, is to ask, well, what's wrong with the old natural law theory the old natural law theory of St. Thomas. And I get the impression that modern day philosophers like Germain Grisset, John Finnis, and the third one in that triad was
Joseph Boyle.
Well, yeah.
They were referred to as the Gang of Three.
Yeah, the Gang of Three, yeah. While they might be well-intentioned, if they think they're going to improve on what St. Thomas has written, then I think they're deluding themselves, to be quite honest. So, because St. Thomas is considered as the master philosopher, theologian that the church, that God has ever blessed his church with. So, sure, they can explain aspects and apply to concrete situations which St. Thomas never faced, but the principles have to come from Aristotle and St. Thomas. Otherwise, if they're inventing new principles, then, or they're not understanding correctly the principles they find in St. Thomas and Aristotle, then they have problems.
There's an irony in what you're saying, and we can explore it a bit later. But just as Tracey Rowland is keen to connect with people that she thinks a straightforward Thomistic position doesn't really connect with, a great motivation for the new natural law people was to see how far they could go with natural law simply based on the structure of practical reason. Mm-hmm. Nothing more than that. Let's see how far we can get. And for their trouble, they were oftentimes dismissed as Kantians. And you've got reasons to challenge Tracey Rowland. Well, let's go ahead. How did you come to lock horns? Metaphorically speaking.
Metaphorically speaking, yes.
Is it because she was in Perth, or because she wrote on a topic that you care about and she got it wrong, you think?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I've found great instruction in my own personal philosophical education in the works of Father Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange. Now, a friend of mine had been reading one of Tracey Rowland. I'd never really particularly heard of her. One of her books, what is it called? Ratzinger's Faith, the Theology of Benedict XVI or something. I think that's the title of it. And in the early section of that, she gives a bit of a brief, or rather she fires a broadside at neo-Thomists, of whom she called Garrigou-Lagrange the leader, implying that they were Kantians, didn't understand history, that they're rather dull mentally and all these sorts of things, you know, evils which certainly did not attach to them. And when I read that, to be quite honest, I was very annoyed by it. So I thought, well, what else has this lady written, this Dr. Rowland? So I went searching on the internet and I found an obscure article called Natural Law from Neo-Thomism. So when I saw Neo-Thomism, I thought, what's this about? So I went and read that article. I found that her target there was Jacques Maritain, and she was treating him in a similar fashion to Garrigou-Lagrange, for example, without giving any evidence that she's actually read or studied what they've said. She just makes comments and suggestions about them. She doesn't engage with their texts or with their position and try and present a philosophical counter-argument. She just makes assertions about them. So when I saw that, and when I saw going hand in hand with that, what she was saying about natural law, which from my own understanding at that time I could readily see or already see, was contrary to St. Thomas and certainly contrary to the Pope. So I decided to involve myself a little bit more with actually analysing what she said. So what I did, I took an article which was published in Communio back in 2008, and I reproduced it almost totally line by line. And after each sentence, sentence by sentence, I should say, I've made a comment and I've opposed to what she said, in many instances, statements from papal documents, the magisterium of the church, with a particular emphasis in this work of comparing her statements to the statements of Pope Benedict XVI, which she's written 2 books about. And I found that from start to end, she was actually contradicting papal teaching in a very serious way. And now that is a serious matter for any theologian, but for one who occupies a position of influence in educational institutions, it's a very serious thing. But anyway, so I decided to go through and complete this work, and that's effectively the genesis of my book. That became its motivating principle at the beginning, but the real benefit, I think, coming out of the work is that it gives an exposition of papal teaching that Catholics and other people of goodwill, because it's a philosophical exposition, it's not a theological exposition, so one doesn't have to be a believing Catholic in order to grasp it and appreciate it. So it can be appreciated by people simply in the light of reason. It gives people a good, I would hope, a good grasp, a good perspective of what the Church actually teaches about the natural moral law, in defending arguments against moral principles, and what the Church says about the natural law and how it should be seen compared to articles of faith and things like that. So I hope that's the main good that's coming out of the book, or will come out of the book, that people actually can get a good grasp of what the popes have said about philosophy, St. Thomas, and what they've said about the natural moral law, and how that perspective, from the perspective, like the Church and St. Thomas say, the moral law it springs up within us because it's in our created nature. It comes from nature and reason. It's not imposed specifically by a positive law from the outside, even though divine positive law in the Old Testament, in the form of the 10 Commandments, for example, confirms what we learn by synderesis within ourselves, within our own nature, about the natural moral law. So
let me, what could I say, push and pull here a little bit and try to get a focus that maybe will help us understand what's at stake. A first question. When we talk about natural law, when you talk about natural law, can it be understood without reference to Catholic theology?
Certainly.
Certainly.
Absolutely. Not only that, if we didn't grasp it, and we grasp it by judgment, we don't reason to it. It's based on the philosophy or the notion of being. Now, the notion of being, which we grasp in whatever we apprehend, causes within us the first principle of thinking, the act of judgment. When we grasp the notion of being, like when we see something that exists, that it's being, we already immediately within that, on doing that, grasp its opposition, non-being, and we see the difference between being and non-being. We judge that being is, non-being is not, and that's the principle of non-contradiction. In other words, as St. Thomas says, thought follows being. Was Dr. Woodbury, a famous Australian marist who founded the Aquinas Academy in Sydney shortly after the Second World War, would say, think follows thing. So our thought is activated, if you like, by external reality, the notion of being. Now, from that notion of being, we understand that to know being is good, okay, and that appetizes the will to desire the object, which is, because goodness is found in things. whereas truth is in the mind. But truth in the mind is about objective reality outside the mind. So once our intellect grasps the first principle of reasoning, and we can't reason without that, so we have no intellectual life at all if we haven't grasped the principle of non-contradiction. And it's the same with appetizing the will, the principle of synderesis, which we learn by practical judgment, to desire or to seek good and shun evil. That's the foundation, the most general principle of the natural moral law. We start to grasp these things even as infants, as children. For example, if you give a child something tasty to eat, so he senses it, and once he's tasted, he desires it, he likes it. If you take it away from him, it upsets him because you're taking away the good that he wanted, that he's already desired. And this is the base, this desire of good is the basis of the natural moral law. Now, if we don't, human nature is like that, whether it's baptized and has been given the gift of faith or not. It's a common human nature for every single human being, right from Adam to the last man who will ever live. So, yeah, we do not need, but having said that, the gift of faith certainly is a very great help in strengthening and fortifying us, what we learn from our own nature and the nature in the world by reason. It's certainly a very great help. And it also gives us grace to help us to act according to the moral law, because we do come into this world with a fallen human nature, and that sort of drags us down and pulls us away from obeying the right principles of the natural moral law, if you like. It causes disorder in our passions and our will. So we do really need the assistance of grace actually to live and keep the natural moral law.
Let me ask this. It connects with what we've been thinking about. When Thomas speaks of the natural law, in due course, he comes to say that it's our participation in the eternal law.
That's correct, yes.
And our participation is a participation that's free and intelligent. Trees also participate in the eternal law, but they do so in an arboreal fashion, not in a human fashion. Yes. So if somebody says, well, I took you on your word, and I started to read Thomas, and you said that what I'd find out about the natural law was independent of Catholic theology, and if it's independent of Catholic theology, I kind of thought that you meant that it was independent of theology, and I keep reading, and I see that the whole thing is participation in the eternal law of God. Now, if that's not a theological claim, says our interlocutor, I don't know what is.
That's it's a philosophical position, because it refers to the way that God rules creation, all of creation. And he rules creation by, first of all, creating the created nature which he's given it, so that things act according to their nature. Like it's in the nature of apple trees to grow apples, orange trees to grow oranges, and not for apple trees to grow figs. So that's purely, and it's in the nature of an animal, a monkey, to live according to sense, appetite, and passion, emotion. It's in the nature of a human being, because we are both spiritual and material, to live according to our own nature, and that's defined as rational animal. Animal referring to the bodily side, the material part of our nature, whereby we find the passions, the emotions, the vegetative side of nutrition, so forth, growth, all that's to do with our bodily side of our nature. But the intellective side of our nature, or the spiritual side of our nature, is the faculties of that are intellect and will. Now, gaining knowledge, we start with sense perception. So our knowledge comes through the senses. And, this is getting off the subject perhaps a little bit, but
that's our specialty. That's our specialty.
Yeah, well.
But now, Frank, suppose this fellow, I don't know where we met him. We were just walking along, and he comes up to us and starts listening in. And suppose now he says, well, you just said that the crucial theological question, the question, does God exist and what's he like?
Yeah.
You just turned that into a philosophy question. How did you do that? That was a sleight of hand. And you say to him, what?
Well, when you talk about God, you're not talking about, you have to understand the difference between faith and reason, what faith is and what reason is. Faith is an infused virtue that we receive at baptism. If you're talking to someone who doesn't have that, then it's difficult for him to see perhaps, but the distinction between faith and reason is real. We have human nature. If we didn't have human nature, spiritual nature, we couldn't receive the gift of faith. Monkeys, for example, can't receive the gift of faith because they don't have that spiritual essence which has the potential to receive a spiritual gift or be raised by God to perform a supernatural act. Like
they are not capax Dei. They are not capax Dei.
So when we talk about natural moral law being a created reality, we're investigating things that are open to be investigated by human reason. All our knowledge, as I said, comes through the sense from the creator. All our human knowledge, our natural knowledge, comes from the world around us. And that's the source of, that's the origin of our concepts. That's what our willings is ordered towards, to organise ethics. Now, coming to the question of the existence of God, God, as St. Thomas showed quite distinctively, the existence of God can be proved from reason. We might say these arguments that St. Thomas had, the 5 arguments, all start off with what we perceive in the created world around us, and from that we reason syllogistically to the existence of God. God is in the predicates. God is not the subject. We're not saying God is the principle of our reasoning, like we're taking a starting point from God and then drawing conclusions subsequent to positing or accepting the existence of God. We're actually reasoning to the existence of God. It's an a posteriori argument. It's not an a priori argument, for example. So this moral law is, as you say, it's a direct participation in the eternal law by which God governs all creation. God governs creation by giving them a nature, by having their nature act according to the nature that it is, if that makes sense.
Now, if this fellow who joined us while we were minding our own business, this guy who keeps asking questions, if he said, well, I respect your feelings, you might very well say, a fig on my feelings. And I noticed that you have, as the guiding principle stated up front in your book, what's stated at the bottom of every email I get from the president of the American Maritime Association. Every email I get has this at the bottom. You state it at the top of your book, and I'm going to read it. The study of philosophy does not consist in knowing what others have thought. We might add, or feel,
Mm-hmm.
but to know the truth of things.
Yeah.
Now, a whole lot of people would stop and maybe not just stop a whole lot of people in our century, but a whole lot of people in a whole lot of centuries. And one of them would be named Pontius Pilate. And he asked Jesus, this has been a matter of concern for quite some time.
Mm.
What is truth? All right, so you want us to focus on truth. The president of the American Maritime Association wants to focus on truth. I sure want to focus on truth. Why is truth so controversial? I mean, not whether this is true or that is true, but why is truth itself so controversial?
Well, all the people who say, oh, doubt truth or truth doesn't exist, to make assertions like that, they have to actually appeal to the principle they're trying to deny. Like someone says, oh, truth doesn't exist. How do you know that's true? You've just appealed to the principle that you're denying in order to deny it. So there's an irrationality there. Truth is the grasp of reality, the judgment about reality that the intellect makes. So the knowledge that I have of something is true knowledge. It's not just a feeling or an emotion or an opinion. And
insofar as we take anything to be intelligible, insofar as scientists presuppose an intelligibility about the objects of their study, well, we're supposing there's a truth to be had. We might not have it fully. Thomas says we'll never know everything there is to know about a grain of sand, but nonetheless, grains of sand are intelligible. You put them under a microscope because you think you can find out something more about their intelligible structure.
Yeah. St. Thomas is not only is truth, as St. Thomas would say, an adequation between an object, something outside the mind, and the mind itself, so that what is in the mind conforms to the reality outside of the mind. He says truth is actually had subjectively by the knower, knowing something, in the act of judgment, making it true affirmative judgment, and which is what I was talking about earlier, the principle of non-contradiction. In making that judgment, we're also grasping the fact that its opposite is false. That's the basis, that's the foundation of our entire intellectual life. St. Thomas quotes Aristotle in this regard, and I think I've quoted this actually in my book. It's a principle of all our reason. Judgment is the basis of reasoning. Judgment is not reasoning. Reasoning is the comparison of two judgments by means of a medium of demonstration, which we call mediated knowledge. Immediate knowledge is a judgment. That means it's without a medium of demonstration. Neither can it have one, or neither does it need one, because it's immediate grasp without having to reason to a conclusion, if that makes particular sense. And these first practical judgments, theoretical judgments and practical judgments, first theoretical judgment, being is, non-being is not, which gives rise to the principle of non-contradiction, which we grasp. And the first practical judgment, seek good, avoid evil, both come from the notion of being. The first one comes from the transcendental, or is what we call the transcendental mode of being known as truth, i.e. being true being. And the second one, the synderesis, the practical judgment, seek good and avoid evil, comes from the transcendental mode of being as being good. Now, we can understand this beings stand between the divine intellect and the human intellect. They get the existence, their truth, and their goodness in the one act of creation of each being from God the Creator.
All right, now I've got one last philosophical question. And then it's going to really get tough because I have a political question. But we'll coast along. We'll coast along on one last philosophical point. Maybe it's just a rumination. If there's anything that performatively, that is to say, in what's being said, if there's anything that's performatively the case about truth, is that people believe it's the truth when they say they have a right to X, Y, or Z.
Yeah.
Now, rightly or wrongly, when the going gets rough and the ethical discussion gets in the neighborhood of brass tacks, if not iron knuckles, people are likely to say something like, but I got a right to. Now, that can be petty and self-serving, but when I've introduced natural law thinking to students, I've usually introduced it not in chronological order, but towards the last quarter of a class, not a class session, but a whole course. And I said, now, there is an alternative, a kind of perennial alternative to what we've been looking at. And it's called natural law theory. And then I say something like, I suspect today that most people who are sympathetic to natural law theory are sympathetic to it because they accept that there are basic human rights.
Yes, certainly.
Across the board human rights. And then maybe I'll tell them about the particular selection of natural law thinkers. And you won't be surprised I mention Jacques Maritain.
Yeah. And I would add too.
He was one of the central figures in the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights.
Correct.
And Pope Benedict XVI oftentimes appealed to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I'm not quite sure you'll like this phrase. He didn't say it was a lingua franca, but he did say it was a common language.
Yeah, well, yeah.
Yes.
Because you said it the correct way.
Now, philosophy is full of twists and turns. And we're not going to totally forget Tracey Rowland. She wouldn't let us. But there's a very much cited and influential student of human rights named Samuel Moyen. And I came to read Samuel Moyen, who has a secular background, very definitely, in writing on a paper about human rights and Jacques Maritain. Now, what's Moyen's take? I was surprised when I read him. I guess I was naive. But his take is this. Oh, yes, United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. That was really a conservative document written by conservatives who were opposed to both fascism and communism and wanted to have something that they could appeal to. And he said, the trouble with it is the conservatives, people like Konrad Adenauer, for example, lived to be 92. I don't think he was a vegan, but lived to be 92. At any rate, people like Adenauer and Maritain, mentions them by name, really what they were doing is they were trying to smuggle Christian ethics into the public sphere.
Mm-hmm.
And nice try, guys. Better than fascism, better than communism. But the world is now largely non-Christian. And we got to give human rights a different grounding. We can't have people scraping at human rights and finding that underneath are a group of European Christians. And this is a little bit like Tracey Rowland. How are we going to talk to people, right? A little bit like that. Now, here I am. I want to say something about Maritain. This is just a quote. It's short, direct quote. He says, I am concerned with the principles as much as and more than with the conclusions, and with the rational justification of human rights as much as and more than with a practical agreement thereon. Let me say that one more time. It's not too long. I am concerned with the principles as much as and more than with the conclusions. Speaking of the Human Rights Declaration, and with the rational justification of human rights as much as and more than with a practical agreement thereon. So if Maritain were here today, I think he would say, yeah, we didn't talk about our fundamental principles, but what we were trying to do is, avoid World War III and come out of the ashes. And what we got, we think is really good, and we might have come at it from different directions, and give me another 92 years of life, and I'll focus on, lived as long as Adenauer, I'll focus on the fundamental justification. How does my little rant connect with your thinking?
Well, absolutely, because in philosophy, as Maritain would well say, and it's implicit in his statement, all light comes from the principles. The adaptation of practical laws in the concrete may vary, they may be unsuitable in one time or another time, but the actual principles for making human laws all are found in the natural moral law, the correct principles. And that's the basis of making good positive laws, good legislation. Now, what particular legislation or positive laws that a society adopts at a certain period of history may have to be modified to some extent to be more suitable in the concrete specific application in which it's applied in another period of history. I don't believe that this author you've just quoted can show that the concrete application of the principles that were put in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights need to be changed now, because we're still dealing with a society made up of human beings who need to live, who need to eat, who need to have shelter, who need to have an education, who need to be able to establish a family, who need to have certain rights from the politics, from the state to protect family, to protect women with children, all these sorts of things which are in the actual Universal Declaration of Human Rights. These need to be maintained. How that's applied in a particular concrete circumstance is more a matter of a determination through the virtue of prudence. And that can vary from place to place, from society to society, from circumstance to circumstance, because the concrete circumstances in which we live are always changing. They're always fluid. They're not determined to one particular point or place in time. So really, that aspect certainly can be reviewed and updated a little bit, but the actual principles behind these things, that can never change, because these principles come from reality, they come from human nature, they come from reason operating within human nature and about the things that about the world we live in. So, yeah, Maritain certainly is right, and I would agree with him 100%. Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks. I like it when people agree with me and Maritain. It happens once every 5 or 6 years.
yeah, well, no, that's good. That's good. No, Maritain was a great philosopher. Yeah, great respect for him.
We're really over time, but that doesn't mean we can't take some extra time. But it does mean I'm going to let you off a little easy on your discussion of politics, which I threatened you with. Now,
Okay.
you are a keen student of papal encyclicals.
Sure.
It happens that here in the United States of America, say starting around 2015, we've been at it for 7 years. Our first presidential candidate was in 2016.
Mm-hmm.
There's a party called the American Solidarity Party. American Solidarity Party. And the Solidarity, well, we borrowed that from John Paul II.
Mm-hmm.
And American, well, we thought, we're not all Polish.
No.
And there's a lot of people in the United States that think that solidarity means solidarity forever in terms of the French Revolution or some such. So, American Solidarity Party. Now, despite our best efforts, Frank, to communicate,
Sure.
some people say, oh, that's the party that reads the papal encyclicals. Now, nobody has ever said that of Democrats or Republicans or Libertarians. They've only said that of our party. That's the party that reads the papal encyclicals. All right, let's go to your side of the world.
Mm-hmm.
Were there a party in Australia that really drew consciously from the papal encyclicals?
Mm-hmm.
How might such a party at least begin to challenge status quo politics in Australia?
Sure. Actually, certainly in moral issues, from the principles of the natural moral law. As I say, this is not a specifically Catholic thing or Christian thing. It's a human thing. It's common. It's common to in every human nature that's ever existed or will exist. People who deny it, and we can say, look, for example, if someone tells lies about somebody else or slanders them, people immediately, when they've been slandered, whether they're Christian or non-Christian, baptised or unbaptised, take offence at that. They know they've been injured. Now, that's because, all right, we will say from a position of divine positive law, that's forbidden by the 8th commandment. For example, don't bear false witness against your neighbour. But it's also part of the natural moral law. Because the natural moral law, for example, first of all, we have an inclination to live. We know that it's good for us to live. Murder opposes that as a positive law, but we already know that if someone tries to kill us, whether we're Christian or non-Christian, we're going to take action to defend ourselves. We eat food. Everybody eats food in order to keep living. We get sick, we go and seek medical treatment in order to keep living. This is evidence of something within each human being that wants to prolong its life. People naturally want to get married and have a family, whether they're Catholic or not Catholic. That's another aspect of the natural moral law. A positive law that protects that is, thou shalt not commit adultery, because of the need of marriage to raise a family and a lifelong union between man and wife. Stealing. We have a natural inclination to use the world's goods for our own benefit, it's to subdue the earth, and have rights as individuals to acquire land and property. The objective commandment, positive law, thou shalt not steal, is there because theft fractures or injures that natural desire which comes from our nature to have a home, have land and possessions so that we can live comfortably, so that we can educate ourselves, our children, whatever the case may be. Now, the case with the Eighth Commandment, with commutations between people, people living in society together, that's one of the things that Thomas says is in the natural law, and it pertains more to us specifically as our human nature is concerned because of our spiritual nature. The good name that which should exist between people, people have a right to their own good name, for example. An atheist who says he doesn't believe in the natural, or doesn't believe in the natural law, if you tell lies about him in public, say that he's such and such and such and such, when he's not, even if he is, when he's not, he's going to be injured by it, and he's going to take some sort of a retaliatory sort of action because you've actually injured him. That's what I'm saying. This natural law it's part of our human nature, and the full gamut of it is coming from the teaching of St. Thomas. To say that, this is a specific Catholic thing, which is sort of implied by saying, oh, that's the party that reads the papal encyclicals, meaning they're being guided by Christian principles and not human natural principles. That's a subtle way of dismissing you, so they can ignore you publicly. And Benedict XVI sort of refers to this in one of his addresses, and I've quoted that address in my book where it can be read. The other thing for people interested in politics, I would recommend some more books just published by En Route Books and Media by my colleague and friend, Dr. Donald Boland. One is Ethics Today and St. Thomas Aquinas. That's another excellent book that I recommend to everyone, particularly students, because it was originally, the contents of that book were originally given as a series of lectures to seminarians by the author of the book, but it's been formulated to be an academic book. I would recommend it very much for young people in Catholic institutions, even secular institutions, because it's purely a philosophical book about ethics and the natural law, about virtue, about happiness. And these are the sorts of books I think that young people need to be reading in conjunction with the papal encyclicals, because these books are totally philosophical. Another book that Don has just had published is Political Science and Thomas Aquinas. That's another great book that people could actually read, especially younger people who won't get this in their education, whether it's in a secular university or in a Catholic university. Because I said earlier, the deficiency in the teaching St. Thomas, I think in a lot of cases is quite deliberate, because of, certain people in charge of these institutions have to know about the papal recommendations of St. Thomas, but they actually ignore them or deliberately flaunt them. So that's up for the individual to answer for themselves. But for younger people coming through, because younger people really are the hope of the humanity, the future, they have to be educated properly. They have to have the truth at their disposal. If they're interested, they will find in books like this and other great books and so forth a gold mine of knowledge, and this is what really needs to how younger people need to form themselves, because they form themselves. We can only give them the materials by which to do it. It's like a dietitian. A dietitian can only recommend to us good food to eat. It's not food that nourishes us. We nourish ourselves from the food we eat. We're the active agent in the process of eating. The food is just what we eat. Like, for example, Chesterton once said, the idea with opening the mind, as with opening the mouth, is to close it again on something solid. Now, in reference to food, we close it again on something solid, something that's good for us, and we nutrify ourselves from it with teaching and instruction, the teacher can only give that by which the student, who is the main course of his own, the main source of, who educates himself, we can only give him something that he can digest readily and that's good for him, and that's the truth. By giving him the truth, we're giving him something by which he's nourishing his intellectual life, his moral life, from having something, instead of eating poisoned food full of chemicals and artificial colourings and things like that. We give them plain, solid truth from St. Thomas and good authors, then they're not getting all these added poisons. And when they have a healthy education, then they can identify the poisons in all these other aberrant philosophical systems. It's pointless taking a student through an eclectic series of ancient, Middle Age, Renaissance and modern philosophers without giving them the solid doctrine first by which to judge all these things. If they're not formed correctly to think in the first place and know what the basis of a true philosophy is, then they're going to become lost in an ocean of conflicting opinions. Instead of giving a smorgasbord of what other people have said and not being concerned, they need something whereby they're gaining the truth of what's being said. And this is what the recommendation that you refer to by Maritones, the one that I've included in my book. That's the objective of education, because only once we have the truth and the solid grounding in that can we judge rightly all these aberrant systems, all the bad political systems, bad systems of law, why it's a bad system of law, why it's bad politics, why it's bad ethical principles in a Catholic hospital or a non-Catholic hospital, why it's a bad government decision here, what's bad in business. So from the time of Leo XIII, Pope Leo XIII talks about a great harvest of good being in the public order if people only understood the philosophy of St. Thomas. We see that that's absent now because St. Thomas has been jettisoned. So anyway, I'm talking too much.
No, you're not. It's just that we have this producer named Sebastian Mahfoud.
Okay.
No one has ever called him the knife.
The knife.
Because he usually lets us talk as long as we want. But we are at a pretty natural closing point. Two thoughts. One thought, I've never had a good discussion with a good philosopher like you, or John Finnis, or if I ever have a discussion with Tracey Rowland, I've never had a discussion with a philosopher who hasn't recommended a book. So that's one thing that all you philosophers have in common.
No,
and I think that even though there's this skepticism about truth, as you point out, even the skeptic wants to say that we should be, it's true, skeptical about truth. Oh. Now, as Christians, as Catholics, we know the answer to the question, the ultimate answer to the question, what is truth? Our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ says, I am the way, the truth, and the light. And so as always on this program, we end with the gospel for the day. And this is from Matthew. Jesus said to his disciples, if your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you have won over your brother. If he does not listen, take one or two others along with you so that every fact may be established on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. If he refuses to listen to them, tell the church. If he refuses to listen even to the church, then treat him as you would a Gentile or a tax collector. Matthew was a tax collector. Got treated very well. Amen, I say to you, whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven again. Amen, I say to you, if 2 of you agree on earth about anything for which they are to pray, it shall be granted to them by my heavenly Father. For where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, there am I in the midst of them. Come, Lord Jesus, come. Thanks so much, Frank. Really appreciate it. We'll have to get this Bolin guy on.
Yeah. May I, just before we conclude, if I may, I don't mean to intrude, but this I think will be very nice for Catholics. Philosophy is the study of the acquisition of wisdom. Are you still with me?
Yes.
Okay. Holy Mother Church honours Our Lady with the title Seat of Wisdom. There are some beautiful readings in the Old Testament, the Book of Wisdom, that refer specifically to women, to wisdom as a she, as a lady. Obviously, it's a direct reference to Our Lady. So I'd just like to read a little bit from the Book of Wisdom, if I may, just to supplement what you've just read from the Gospel. Beautiful is wisdom. Her brightness never grows dim. She is readily seen by those who love her and found by those who look for her. Quick to anticipate those who desire her, she makes herself known to them. Keep watch for her at dawn, and you will not be disappointed. You will find her sitting at your gate. Even to think about her shows understanding fully grown. To be on the alert for her will quickly allay your anxieties. He who keeps vigil for her sake shall quickly be free from care. She walks about looking for those who are worthy of her, and graciously shows herself to them on the road, in every thought of theirs coming to meet them. Of her, the most sure beginning is the desire for discipline. Care for discipline means loving her. Loving her means keeping her laws. Obeying her laws guarantees incorruptibility, and incorruptibility leads to the presence of God. And thus the desire for wisdom leads to sovereignty. If then you find pleasure in throne and scepter, you princes of peoples, honour wisdom that you may reign forever. Amen.
Thanks very much, Frank. Thanks for taking the time to join us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jim. It's been a pleasure to talk to you. It really has been.
Godspeed. Godspeed. And don't ever retire.
Oh, I won't. Okay. God bless you, Jim.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.